Hallo zusammen, schön, dass ihr wieder eingeschaltet habt.
Hello everyone, great to have you tuned in to a new Laco video. Nearly 12 weeks of testing and dozens of test series. The result? Excellently tested and uniquely certified Laco pilot watches according to DIN norm 8330. Today, we are talking about the Laco novelties right after the intro.
Lange Zeit ist es her.
It's been a long time. All the more, I am delighted to have him back by my side. Uwe Rücker, Managing Director of Laco. Welcome, Mr. Rücker.
Hello, Amina.
Nice to have you back.
I'm glad to be here.
Ich glaube, Sie freuen sich genauso wie ich auf diesen Talk heute zu den
I believe you are as excited as I am about today's talk on the new DIN watches Hamburg and Hamburg GMT. They are indeed something very special. Laco has worked on them for a long time. To even obtain certification, the watches had to undergo rigorous testing. It was a very long and exciting development process, and we will talk about all of that and much more today. Both watches are tested and certified according to DIN 8330. Not everyone out there might initially understand what that means. What is the purpose of a DIN standard?
Beabsichtigt eine DIN-Norm überhaupt?
Ja, die DIN-Norm, wir haben sie auch auf dem Tisch liegen, jetzt schon einige Seiten.
The DIN standard, which we have lying on the table, has quite a few pages and regulates what needs to be done in a watch or how the watch should look to be suitable for visual flight or instrument flight. In essence, it replaces an instrument in the cockpit and must therefore, of course, meet the requirements that a cockpit instrument would have. That means it must be easy to read, not interfere with other instruments, fit into the overall picture, be easily understandable, but also meet strict technical requirements regarding its own susceptibility to interference. This is what the DIN standard regulates.
Das regelt die DIN-Norm.
So, in short, it's a developed standard for technical and optical requirements of pilot watches.
Es gab einen Vorläufer, die Teststaff.
Exactly. There was a predecessor, the test staff, which was a standard that started in 2012, and the DIN standard essentially replaced it. The test staff is now 12 years old, and the DIN standard has now also been around for a few years and precisely regulates these issues for aviation.
Diese Themen für den Flugbetrieb.
But it also expanded the requirements.
Glaube ich, erweitert.
Yes, it increased some and expanded some. Also, the DIN standard also includes other standards, such as those for water resistance, impact tests, or anti-magnetic signatures. So, several DIN standards that are nested within each other.
So who sets these requirements? Where does the DIN standard come from?
A committee that worked on it. For one, the University of Applied Sciences in Aachen.
Where these tests took place we'll come to later.
Exactly. And a few pilot watch companies or watch manufacturers were also part of that committee that influenced the decision-making from the perspective of watchmaking. The Sin Watch company was also significantly involved here.
Admittedly, it was a very large and demanding project. Why did Laco specifically decide to do it?
Because we already had a certified watch with the big Navigator watch back in the 1940s, we naturally felt compelled to do this when a new certification option became available for a pilot watch, being a traditional company like Laco. We've had this on our agenda for some time now, and we started the project in the middle of, I think, 2016 or 2017, and were relatively far along. Then came COVID-19 and all the testing labs were closed, and there was also an opportunity to exchange ideas. And now, after COVID-19, we have finally made it over the finish line, even with the tests and everything that goes with it. It was a lot of work, simply understanding what the DIN standard says and what you have to comply with. For example, it describes the dial in great detail, what is permissible, what isn't, how long the indices can be, how wide they can be, how many numerals can be on them, etc. There are a lot of regulations that have to be adhered to precisely, so you have to think about it for a while, including how exactly you want to do it.
And now, having completed the process, it's really a testimonial for the whole company, isn't it?
That's what it feels like, yes, exactly. That we've achieved something which basically proves that we are particularly familiar with pilot watches.
In der Fliegeruhrenwelt zu Hause sind, genau.
In einem Zitat von Ihnen, Herr Rücker, heißt es...
In a quote from you, Mr. Rücker, it says, Our DIN 8330 certified pilot watch is a milestone in Laco's history. We just heard that the entire Laco team has been working on it for years. What is the challenge behind such a major milestone?
Hinter so einem großen Meilenstein.
Es geht erstmal damit los, dass man sich die DIN-Norm beschafft und schaut, was da überhaupt drin steht.
The first step is to get a copy of the standard and see what it actually says. It's not publicly available. You have to buy it and then read through it with all the departments to see what it means, starting with the graphic design and the technical requirements that are in there. And how can you link them together? Which options do we already have? What other things do we need to do to even start moving in the direction that is required by the standard? And then, of course, a lot of graphic design. You have to make sure that you incorporate as much Laco DNA as possible while still maintaining the requirements of the DIN standard. And that includes things like line thicknesses for minutes and second indices, hand colors, or colors in general. There's a lot of very detailed description. And to connect that with the technical demands behind it and the typical Laco face.
Sehr kleinteilig beschrieben. Und das eben in Verbindung zu bringen mit dem technischen Anspruch, der dahinter steht und dem typischen Laco-Gesicht auch.
Sie haben ja gerade gesagt,
You've just explained that the technical and visual requirements are specified down to the smallest detail in the DIN standard. How much design freedom does that leave you with to bring the Laco character into your own watches?
Die eigenen Uhren reinzubringen?
Ja, dadurch, dass die DIN-Norm natürlich
Yes,
auch
the fact that the DIN standard was of course co-created by companies that manufacture typical aviation products means that attention has also been paid to ensure that this description does indeed produce a pilot watch. But then it does become very cockpit, very typical pilot watch. So you no longer have the freedom to do things that you would normally do in the design of a watch. To a certain extent you're limited, but because we're particularly familiar with pilot watches and many of these elements are familiar to us, we were of course able to incorporate the Laco DNA well.
DNA von Laco gut einbringen.
Let's break down the Laco DNA into its individual parts. What are the typical Laco elements that can be found in the two watches?
Yes, very typical and visible at first glance is the dark blasted case, which is the typical gray that we already had in the pilot watches in the 1940s. Back then, still lacquered. Today, it is stainless steel blasted gray. We have it in the Laco Original series, we have it in the Pro series, we use it in the Frankfurt GMT, and there's a lot of other things in there too. The shape of the case is from the Frankfurt GMT. The dial, the typical cockpit dial that we also have in the cockpit watch section, comes from this watch, with the distinctive triangle at the top of the 12. The GMT hand, which we now also have here in this version, also comes from this watch. The very distinctive profile of the bezel and the bezel itself come from the sports watch range. The back is embossed like the sports watch and also like the Frankfurt GMT.
Und auch wie die Frankfurt GMT geprägt.
And the black dial, is that specified in the DIN standard, or where does it come from?
Oder woher kommt das?
Ja, das schwarze Zifferblatt
Yes, the black dial is specified in the DIN standard. It must be matte black, and the numerals and hands must be white. And the luminous material is also C1 and is also stipulated.
Wie auch alle anderen Laco-Fliegeruhren wurden
Like all other Laco pilot watches, these two models were named after a German city, namely Hamburg. Is there a story behind it?
Ja, im Grunde kann man am Bogen spannen, aus der Vergangenheit
Yes,
nach heute.
basically, you can draw a line from the past to the present. The observation watches that were built in the 1940s were set in Hamburg via the observatory. This gave them their exact time so that they were accurate before the flight and could then determine the exact position during flight. And this project was also started in Hamburg by the company C-Cotec, which helped us to get involved in the project. Regarding the approach, how to plan a project like this, who has to be involved, and where the test centers are, who the contact persons are, and so on. So basically the whole process that you have to go through. That's why they're called Hamburg.
Ablauf, den man bis zum Ende gehen muss. Deswegen Hamburg.
There are two variants. One is the classic three-hand version, and one is a GMT version. What are the similarities and differences between the two watches?
Ja, die Gemeinsamkeiten, das sieht man als erstes, sind sehr groß. Das heißt,
The similarities, you can see that right away, are very extensive. In other words, the case color, case shape, case size are all the same at first glance, even the dial, of course. But the differences are essentially the GMT display, of course. Here we have the typical Laco hand shape with the frame hand in orange and this 24-hour display divided into a day and a night area in dark gray and light gray, and then printed with a bright orange color for the numerals that are displayed. The movements are also different, of course. The GMT version has a Sellita SW330, and the three-hand version has a Sellita SW200. Both movements are top-grade quality as required by the standard.
Beide Werke sind in der Top-Grade-Qualität, was auch die DIN-Norm fordert.
Does that mean that there are no configuration options?
No, the configuration options are not available because the watches are DIN tested or DIN certified, and because the watches only meet the DIN standard as they are shown here and as we sell them. If we were to install a different dial, or different hands, or a different back, crystal back for example, then the watch would have to be completely DIN tested and DIN certified again. This would also apply to a different anti-reflective crystal, so we're not allowed to make changes in order to retain this DIN certification.
Die technischen Anforderungen der DIN-Norm waren auch nicht ohne, muss man dazu sagen.
It has to be said that the technical requirements of the DIN standard were also quite challenging. The watches were subjected to a very demanding functional and endurance test for weeks. They had to pass 3 categories. The first was functionality, meaning how easy is it to use the watch? How well can it be read? Right now we can see pictures from the accuracy and power reserve tests. The watches were tested for their physical resilience. They took a good hammering from the metal hammer and were sent flying around, or were given a good shake on the vibration device, for example. Among other things, typical aviation liquids such as diesel were also tested. And in the last category, which was about safety, magnetism played a very, very important role. How does the watch behave under cockpit lighting? How compatible is it with the night vision devices? Or what about the strap attachment? And that was really only a small part of the test. In total, there were 16 tests.
Und das war wirklich nur ein kleiner Teil der Prüfung. Insgesamt waren es 16 Prüfungen.
Yes, exactly 16.
Wirklich eine Menge.
So a huge test. To what extent is it possible to prepare the whole test scenario in advance?
The tests are described and the requirements are also described in the DIN standard. The 8330 describes exactly what the 8330 requirements are and also includes other DIN standards that are included in the 8330 as subtests. These include, for example, water tightness, impact resistance, vibration resistance, etc. And of course, you have to study them carefully, the requirements on the one hand, but also how they're tested. And some of the test situations can of course be recreated and then tried out and tested in-house. Of course, you have to prepare for this by thinking carefully about what you are setting out to do. What can I do within the watch to be able to fulfill these specific requirements? And of course, you have to adapt the design visually, but also technically in terms of construction. And of course, we already have a large repertoire of measures that we have taken in the past for our squad watches, for our sports watches, and also for our pilot watches. So you can draw on this knowledge and prepare yourself well by trying these things out in the tests and then gaining certainty that you are doing the right thing or have already done so in the past. And every now and then, when you realize that something isn't working, you have to think about how to improve it. And then with the help of the suppliers and the experts in the test lab, you always find ways and approaches to improve the quality of the individual test results.
Verbesserung der Qualität einzelner Testergebnisse.
So which tests were carried out in-house in advance, for example?
Definitely the impact tests, for example, or the water tightness test. We can do the vibration test, we can test against the typical aviation liquids, and also try out different sealing mechanisms, for example, or try out different approaches in isolation to see which one is probably the right one for this watch.
Um dann zu schauen, welche ist wahrscheinlich für diese Uhr dann die richtige oder die optimale.
What expectations or perhaps stress do you have going into such a demanding testing process?
Prüfprozess rein.
Stress is the wrong word from my point of view. I was more curious and intrigued. It was an exciting experience to see how to get there, how to get to the test, and how the tests are then carried out, to see that everything works, that everything has been worked out, and all of these things. Just having the experience of passing this test, seeing the test results, and seeing it just work is a really nice story.
Letztendlich
In the end, it's the result that counts, and Laco made it. We took the certificate home with us. If you want to find out more about the tests, you can watch our 3-part video series. We followed the whole thing for you on location and recorded it in great detail. The 3 parts are linked in the info box. We are very curious to hear what you guys think. Professor Dr. Jansa, who conducted the tests, mentioned in the test video, among other things, that only a few watch manufacturers in Germany dare to approach the portfolio of tests. How important is further development of the DIN standard in and for the German watch market?
Ich denke, so etwas wie die DIN-Norm für die Fliegeruhr ist eine
I think something like the DIN standard for pilot watches is a very German thing. Standardizing things and clarifying what you can expect from a product, which requirements the product meets, and what you get for your money. And also to know exactly in which bandwidth, in which framework condition the product works. That's a very German idea. We know it from the industrial processes where certain procedures are standardized. And I think it's also quite good for the watch industry in general, and for the pilot watches in particular, to have a standard and to know exactly what to expect from the product. What can I expect and what can't I expect? And I also think it's good to be able to really measure this and not just describe what the watch does in fancy words, but with hard facts. That's why I think it's a good idea that needs to be developed further. It would also be nice if more and more people would get on board and do these tests. And further standards are being developed for watches that have to meet certain characteristics.
Und auch weitere Normen entstehen für Uhren, die bestimmten Eigenschaften entsprechen sollen.
We are slowly reaching the end, Mr. Rücker. Finally, it has to be said that this has been a long development process with many people involved.
Ja. Yes,
it was an extensive exchange between many areas, those being standardization bodies, test labs, and employees from our own company, of course. I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone involved, working together very intensively, sometimes on a very friendly basis, and it was great fun for everyone to pass these tests and work towards them. So, thank you very much for that. I would also like to thank the company SIN in particular, because SIN encouraged us to get involved in this project. SIN also helped us to understand the typical hurdles that can and should be expected in such a project. We had a very pleasant, very friendly meeting in Frankfurt at the start of the project. So, many thanks for that too.
Vielen Dank dafür.
If you choose one of the 2 watches, it will be delivered to your home in an aluminum case, which we already know from the Frankfurt GMT. Let's open the whole thing up.
Yes, obviously the watch inside as expected, but also a hang tag, which we already know from the Frankfurt GMT. There it is orange, here we now have a gray one reading ready for takeoff. And of course the corresponding documents.
So lots of nice little gadgets that come on top. We are very excited to hear what everyone has to say about the new Laco DIN watches. Please let us know in the comments. Other than that, Mr. Rücker, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for the interview.
My pleasure. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.